Hey folks, I hope you're all well and having a good weekend and that the weather's been relatively nice for you. As promised, this video is going to be discussing the 9.2 Paladin tier set bonuses, the 2 set and 4 set, respectively, based off our current proc raid values for things like Art of War, and how that is going to impact Mythic Plus specifically when compared to the proc rates of Imperium Power. Because if you remember, the 4 set, as current, is Wake has a 50% chance to be reset on every Art of War proc. So, taking that into account, is that going to push us into Blade of Wrath as a full-time talent and take us away from Imperium Power? Because we need to remember, the Blizzard's intention is to try and diversify talent choices, but there is every possibility that, based on our current values, at least in my testing, disclaimer, it's obviously my testing, there is room for error, and where the raid data is concerned, because I didn't play and have instead pulled the data from Warcraft logs, which means it is subjected to even more error, that things might not quite gel properly. But based on the data at hand, we could see our talent choices being more restricted, especially in certain talent rows. Which, although some classes have had or have been in this position for quite a while, it would be bad to see Paladins shoehorned into it because, let's face it, we don't have a lot going for us in terms of viability and options anyway. It'd be worse if we got shoehorned into an even tighter peg. But anyway, let's get into the data. So, my average data across the board, in terms of Art of War procs across all my dungeons, came to 36.2, and my Imperium Power came to 28.2. Interestingly enough, the 0.2 value and all the decimal points or the decimal places that follow it, pretty much the exact same, 0.28571, which I thought was quite interesting. But 36 to 28, seeing as we'll round down to the nearest value. I have removed some of my dungeons from this data set, purely because I didn't run Imperium Power and was instead running Blade of Wrath, but they will come into it shortly in terms of comparisons. So, having Wake reset at 18.14 and Imperium Power reset at the 28 value we discussed, you'd kind of think immediately that, oh, well, Imperium Power's safe, right? Because Imperium Power obviously improves Divine Storm damage, and on average, Divine Storm with the Lego attached equates to about 36% of our total damage over the course of a dungeon, with Wake only adding to 7%. Unfortunately, where Wake is concerned, we can augment the strength of Wake with our conduits. We can't with Divine Storm. Divine Storm is very much stuck as it is. The current 252 Truth's Wake conduit applies a dot to targets hit by Wake of Ashes for 23.4% of its damage over 6 seconds. With the 4 set, especially in Mythic Plus, we are likely to see that conduit's strength rise drastically. Further increased when you consider that by running Blade of Wrath and foregoing Imperium Power, the average proc rate for Wake of Ashes became 28.5. That is higher than the average of 28.2 that we got for the Imperium Power procs. And surprisingly close to the average Art of War proc, 36 at least, for running without Blade of Wrath. Because you got to remember, Blade of Wrath, as a talent, doubles the chance of Art of War being procced anyway. So it kind of makes sense. The difference, though, and I can already hear some of you guys in the comments being like, well, Art of War still proc more. 28 is nowhere near 36. And you're right, it's not a single target. So from a raiding scene, I wouldn't be too worried about this. But you've got to remember, Wake of Ashes is an AoE ability and slaps everything in front of it. paired with the dot as well. Now, as things currently stand, as of the date of this being released, I don't know if conduits are being increased as well. I know that Renown isn't changing, because the player progression is changing to the Cypher of the first ones and Zereth Mortis. But I don't know if conduits are still going to be a thing. If they are, then again, Truth's Wake is just going to get stronger, because that dot that is applied to targets is going to be considerable. When you consider that it is 23% damage currently over 6 seconds, you only need to hit 5 targets, or just over 5 targets, so 6 targets in total, in order to get essentially an extra wake's worth of damage over the course of 6 seconds. Now, for some dungeons, such as Halls of Atonement, where you can quite easily pull packs of 9 or 10 together very, very quickly, those wake resets and that dot value, bearing in mind that, like most dots, I assume that the dot would pandemic if you were to get 2 wake resets applied back to back, RNG wise, that is going to provide considerably more damage, burst damage and otherwise, than an Imperium Power would. And because you've increased the chance of Art of War to proc, you've therefore increased the chance for it to reset. There will, on the other hand, be dungeons such as, say, Plaguefall or Spires of Ascension, where Imperium Power will probably still hold its own because you can't pull as many together as frequently. So, based on the values I've been able to acquire, at least for M+, I suspect that where we will find the change in talent will be more of a personal preference thing. Bit of a cop-out, I know, but the reason I say a bit of a personal preference thing is because I know not everyone pulls, say, Halls of Atonement the way I do. And the big pulls that we have at the start, like we do, on a good day, our Halls of Atonement run is done in about 14 pulls in total. 10 pulls up until the first boss, which is 82% of the total trash in the dungeon. And if you watch my 20 Halls of Atonement video, you'll see that it's done pretty much in like a 2 to 4 minute cadence, because we do big pulls around Ashen Hollow. And the pulls are substantial. And in a situation like that, with an average of 18.14 wake resets, you'd be looking at, or I'd be looking at, on average, having a wake reset per one of those packs, which means that I'd either be able to get 2 Wake of Ashes in, like the first pack of the dungeon, for instance, when we have Bloodlust and everything, be able to get 2 in there with the Truth's Wake conduit, and therefore the dot ticking on everything, versus the maybe 1 or 2 procs of Imperium Power that I'd get that wouldn't really have any lasting effect after casting the ability. But Plaguefall and dungeons like that, where you have lots of packs, but they're relatively small packs, then you're likely to obviously see Imperium Power hold its ground, because it can be used in a plethora of ways. Because it doesn't matter if you're hitting 3 targets or you're hitting 10 targets. Thankfully, because of obviously they thankfully uncapped Divine Storm. But on much, much larger pulls, I believe, based on my data at least, that we will see Wake take the foreground for those keys. And it will definitely take the foreground for things like Top. Because it's a boss rush, we're probably going to want Blade of Wrath or the boss damage as well. Now, talking about boss damage and going into the raid data, the Sanctum of Domination Art of War proc data I've pulled from the top 100 passes for Guardian of the First Ones. Again, I chose that fight because it's got the highest uptime and is probably the fairest representation between players, but not something I can contribute to because I've only got the 1 pull and the 1 kill on Guardian. the PTR data that was able to, or was sent to me by a friend, I have looked at and kind of dismissed, unfortunately, because I don't know the quality of the Ret player involved, and the proc rates don't quite match up for some reason. I don't know the fight itself, I've not looked, but his average pull was only having about 11 Art of War procs. So I can only assume that he either wasn't having a particularly great amount of uptime, or there was something else going wrong. So just looking at the Sanctum of Domination Art of War procs, where for the Guardian between 4 minutes 15 and 5 minutes was the fight criteria, and it averaged 22 procs per kill. That's 11 procs, or 11 potential resets, and those 11 potential resets obviously equate to 11 more Templar's Verdicts. Now, from a rating perspective, I suspect that they are going to be used purely as Holy Power generation. So if Holy Power isn't a problem for us, with the amount of haste and rotational side of things, I suspect that we may still see the 1 minute build hold on, because we just ignore wake damage. Because in a raiding scene, wake is on average about 3.5 to 4% of our total damage, whereas Templar's Verdict, on the other hand, with our conduit, which replicates its damage, is at current 38% of our total damage. So proportionally much different, which means that potentially we could see the situation where we just hold wake. I suspect that won't be the case, but that may be where we see the move to Necrolord and the 6% from Merilith's Capstone when we use Vanquish's Hammer, or we may just see an increase in use of Zeal over Execution Sentence, because that'll increase our weapon speed, which is increases our ability to fish for procs, and Divine Toll, with the way that it works, and Judgment means that we can pretty much keep Zeal up for like 77% of the fight, which is huge, because, you know, that's 77% of the fight where you're just attacking 30% faster. But, so, in summary then, I suspect that the 4-piece is going to have a much greater impact in M+ than it is in raiding. The 2 set, on the other hand, I think is pretty strong when accumulated over the course of a dungeon or a raid fight, even if it is rather boring being 2 seconds, or is going to require quite a bit of finagling or manipulating in order to fully maximize to its benefit. Because, as you guys know, Art of War procs base off white hits or auto swings. So if we want to min-max it, we're going to have to play within our swing timer. Because what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to use our abilities in between the swing timer, so that when Art of War does proc, we have enough time to react to use our next 2 globals efficiently. Because if we're not efficient about it, we'll only get 1 ability in, which means that based on the average human reaction time, you might realize to just get your Wake of Ashes in because it's reset within your Seraphim window. And you got to remember, Seraphim gives crit, haste, it gives all our secondary stats, and the 13% mastery is just a flat 13% damage increase to our spenders. So in an ideal situation, you'd be looking at 50% Wake reset, which is immediately a Wake into a Templar's Verdict, or if you're playing between the 1 and 3 or 1 and 3 range for abilities, or well, I think more accurately we'll be playing between 1 and 4 Holy Power now, rather than like building up to 5 and then spending and then back to 5 again, will be to immediately Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm, and then immediately go into the Blade of Wrath, and then again. Because obviously getting the spenders within the Seraphim window will be our highest priority, which is where the weapon swing timer will come into it. Because you'll want your global cooldown, you don't want anything on global cooldown when the weapon swing comes in and you get that proc. You want to be able to hit an ability immediately, and then with enough haste, hopefully, our GCD will then come off cooldowns just in time for us to smash a second ability within the 2-second window. But Blizzard have also said that they intend for the Seraphim procs to extend the duration of our main Seraphim. So, from a ratings perspective anyway, the average Seraphim uptime over the course of a fight is about 28-29%. So, that's 5 casts. Now, bearing in mind, the 22 Art of War procs, on average, equates to... apologies... 44 seconds. That's almost 3 additional Seraphim casts, because Seraphim lasts for 15 seconds, which means that near 30% is likely to get to 35, maybe 40% of a boss fight, based on the current uptime that we have available to us for a 4-minute fight, or 4.5-minute fight on average, which is pretty big as a self-buff throughout the course of a fight. Because you got to remember, Seraphim, although it's a 45-second cooldown, is one of our largest, or one of our stronger cooldowns for ourselves, because it's just a huge amount of stat amp. And again, in Mythic Plus, an average of 36 seconds means an average of a minute 10, a minute 20 over the course of the dungeon. And for my average Seraphim uptime over the course of a dungeon, I was looking at about 19.2% or 29 casts on average. Which means that I'm probably looking at about 25% over the course of a dungeon, based on Art of War procs. Obviously, in Mythic Plus, it's going to be diminished slightly because you may get an Art of War proc just at the end of the pack dice, which means that the Seraphim has no impact as you're running into the next pack. But still, that increase and that increase to stat amp means that Paladins, we're going to be doing more damage. Not necessarily as consistently, because unfortunately it is based off an RNG value, but if we can fish for it enough, then we're likely to see a more consistent increase in our abilities. So, to summarize then, with all of my data, because I realized it's probably, if this was just a written sheet of paper, it'd look like a wall of text. So, the data that I have performed, or the collected, indicates that based off the current PTR values we're given, that the 9.2 Paladin tier set is likely to be, the 2 set is likely to be more focused at raiding and is a priority for raiders, and the 4 set is the priority in Mythic Plus, which is really weird. Obviously that is subject to change, and I suspect that the raiders will still want the 4 set anyway, because it's more holy power generation. But I feel that the added wake damage is going to be a lot less consequential for raiders than it is for M+, because of the conduit truth wake, because I don't see that ever being taken in a raid setting. Hopefully you guys have liked this video though, and hopefully it's helped. Feel free to comment below, and we will keep this conversation going and keep our eyes towards 9.2 and the changes that come about. For those of you that are happy to see other content though, please comment below and let me know if you want to see this for Warlocks, and I will try and collaborate with some of the more popular Warlock names as well. Because, let's face it, there's not many Paladins for me to chat to. Anyway, folks, hopefully you all have a good night, and I may see you on stream when I go live in a few hours. If not, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll catch you in the next one, folks. Take it easy and take care.